Hi there. Welcome to this episode of Speaking of. We took the summer off, a little hiatus, and worked on some other video projects, but I'm back, ready to dive into some of the issues that are facing our current culture and wrestling with how do we as Christians think through these issues? How does a Christian lens help us to evaluate and understand contemporary issues in our culture? Today, I want to take you through an issue that's unfolding in our state, in the eastern part of Oregon, and it's a story that I think is going to become more and more common in our culture. And I think this story highlights some of the tensions and some of the challenges that Christians live with as we are part of an increasingly secular world. And as we grapple with that question, how do we live in this culture? How do we participate in it without compromising our identity as Christians? The story begins like this. It unfolds in I think in and around the Pendleton area, which is, as I said, it's in eastern Oregon. There's a mom there by the name of Jessica Bates, and sadly, a few years ago, I think about 6 years ago, she and her husband were in a car accident, and she was seriously injured, and her husband was killed, and that left her to raise their five children by herself. Now, as she was doing this, she actually felt that she was able to provide a good and stable home for her children, for her family. And at one point on the radio, she was listening to a preacher or teacher or something that was speaking about the value of adoption. And so Jessica would later on say that when she heard that person speaking, she sensed that it was God Himself directing her to adopt and to open her home to provide a place, a loving home, a loving place for children who are in the state foster care system. Little side note, last year, 2022, there were around 8,000 children in Oregon, just in Oregon, that were in the state foster care system. So that gives you a sense of the need that is out there. Well, Jessica went through the application process. She had a home visit. She attended the classes that are required. I think it's 27 hours of training. All of that required in order to progress through the foster and adoptive parent application process. During the course of the training and during the course of her orientation, she was made aware of one of the laws on the books in Oregon. And I'm going to read it for you so that you can hear it word for word out of the Oregon statute. It says this, that foster and adoptive parents are required to respect, accept, and support the race, ethnicity, cultural identities, national origin, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, disabilities, spiritual beliefs, and socioeconomic status of a child or young adult in the care or custody of the department, and provide opportunities to enhance the positive self-concept and understanding of the child or young adult's heritage. So in short, foster and adoptive parents are required to provide a place where children and adoptive children in the system can be supported and encouraged no matter what their racial, cultural, or ethnic background may be. When she heard this, she spoke up, and this was after she'd completed all of her classes and all of her training, and she actually then spoke up to her case manager and said that she had a problem or a concern with one of the requirements, and that was the statute that I just read out for you. She reported that to the case manager. She reported it to the person in charge of the DHS office in Eastern Oregon and didn't hear back. And then she eventually, to condense it down a little bit, she eventually learned that her application was being denied because she refused to she said that she couldn't comply with, or she couldn't support this particular provision in the law. Now, what was the problem? Why could she not support this? Why did she have a problem with this? Well, in the course of the training and in the course of further conversations with DHS representatives, she was told that supporting a child with a varying sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression would include and would even require things like displaying the rainbow flag, displaying the ally flag, taking the child to attend pride parades, taking the child to participate in other such events that support the LGBTQ lifestyle. Now, I think it's important to remember that this law even applies, and these principles were even expected of parents with real little kids under the age of 9, because that's the age of the child that Jessica was seeking to adopt. Furthermore, in further conversations with the case manager, Jessica was told that if she, for example, she would be dissuaded and discouraged from attending any group or any event that did not support this ideology and this belief. And what that meant in practice is that Jessica, who attended and attends a Christian church that teaches and preaches the traditional message from the Bible of gender as something that is created by God and is innate to our biology. She believed that. The church she attended believed that. The youth group where her kids attended taught that as well. And so if she were to follow this policy, then she would be required then to not attend or to not participate in that church, or she would be at the very least required to leave her child at home in order to attend that church. And she would be required to leave her child at home when her biological children were sent to youth group. And so if she did not agree to do that, she could not be an adoptive parent. And maybe the final and the most concerning requirement is that in order to be an adoptive parent, you would have to agree to providing gender affirming and care, including gender or sex transition care, even for a child under the age of 9. We know this because in follow-up conversations with DHS, Jessica was asked, they were trying to decide if Jessica's application could be approved or not. And so the DHS staff sort of presented a hypothetical in order to try to understand her viewpoints. They said, well, what if you have a child who expresses a desire to transition? And Jessica said, well, look, the children that I'm looking to adopt are under the age of 9. So would you say that a child under the age of 9 should be able to transition? And they said, well, hypothetically, what if they wanted that? Would you provide that? And she said, no, I believe that's a form of child abuse to provide pharmaceutical drugs that would change a person's gender. In other words, puberty blocking drugs. And she says, so no, I would not provide that. And it was then, that was sort of the nail in the coffin. The agency actually then denied her application because she would not assent to the kind of care that is required under the Oregon statute. And so last year, September of last year, about a year ago, her application was denied. This case is making its way through the courts, actually. Jessica is suing DHS. The most recent court date, I believe, was just about a month ago at the end of August. And the judge has not yet, to my knowledge, has not yet rendered a verdict or a finding. Jessica is seeking to overturn this provision in order that she can proceed with an adoption. I want to name a couple of the principles that I think are in play here. What are some of the things that as Christians we should be paying attention to? I think on the one hand, the main issue is not what you think it would be. The main issue, I think this is a secondary issue. The secondary issue is the fact that our culture is increasingly adopting an ideology and adopting a belief that says that gender is entirely self-determined. Gender and sex are fluid, they can change, and we've moved away from a scientific understanding of biology. And this is even, I think, even if you take religion out of the equation for a moment, our culture has moved away from using biology as a means of identifying and understanding what gender actually is. But from a faith point of view, of course, the Christian church has long held that gender is something given by God. It's rooted in our biology. It's rooted down in our very chromosomes, and it's not something that we can change. It's not something that we choose. And to do so is to violate our very nature. Now, there's a whole other, I think, video that we could do on that. How do we understand gender and biology? How should we think of that? That's a huge issue, but I don't think that's actually the main issue here. I do think it is a issue, and it's something we should be concerned about. But in a lot of ways, it's just reflective of the movement in our overall culture. It's just reflective of the direction that we've been going for a long time. And it's something that I think as Christians we ought to speak against. We ought to be articulate in a biblical framework and a biblical understanding of sex and gender as something created by God. We can't create our identity especially when it comes to our sex and our gender. But again, I don't think that's the main issue here. I think the main issue has to do with the way in which government, and especially in Oregon, the government is moving to restrict and limit religious freedoms and to violate religious conscience. The state in this case is requiring a person, if this person wants to adopt, the state is requiring a person to assent to the state's definition of gender and the state's ideology when it comes to gender and sexuality. And so, I mean, in this case, Jessica has a choice. She either chooses not to adopt, or she has to be willing to go along with, she has to violate her conscience and her religious convictions. And that's something that we should all be I think every citizen should be concerned about that. At the very heart of it, I think even if you are someone who rejects the basic principles of the Christian faith, and even if you are someone who believes in and adopts the ideology that affirms LGBTQ plus and gender transition and so on, even if that's where you fall, and you should be concerned about how the state is not allowing for the freedom to have different points of view and different opinions on this. Right? In other words, you're starting to get into a nanny state where the state is dictating the defining ideology and is requiring people to buy into that and to follow along with it. Now, I said earlier that there are something like 8,000 kids that were in foster care for at least a day last year. Now, understanding just a little bit about foster care, sometimes what that means is that kids are placed with relatives for a time. Sometimes it means they're placed very temporarily in foster care. So this does not mean that there are 8,000 kids that are waiting for permanent home and adoption. But there are hundreds that are waiting for adoption. There are hundreds of kids who've been put into the system and because their parents have been deemed to be unfit, their parents are unable to provide for them, and so the state has moved towards putting the children up for adoption. There are hundreds of them. In fact, in Oregon, it's quite a serious need. The system is overloaded. Just as a little side note, the foster care system and the adoptive system in Oregon has come under heavy fire for the way that they have been managing their foster care system, and in part it's because the system is overloaded. So we have this problem of all these kids in foster care, all these kids waiting for and needing a home, and yet the state is deciding that a family, an otherwise fit family, who could provide a loving home and providing a loving placement even for young children, even for sibling pairs, which are sometimes even harder to match, the state is closing the door on that. And there's something really, really wrong about that. That puts the welfare of children, many children, at risk. The state is denying stable and loving homes to many kids who so desperately need them. And that's a shame. Now, what's my analysis? What are my thoughts on this? Well, I think in some ways, as Christians, we should not expect that the state is always going to affirm or even endorse or support even Christian principles and convictions. I think that's unrealistic. I've said before that I think as Christians we need to recognize that we are not living in Canaan. We're not living in the promised land anymore. We're living in sort of Babylon. That means that as in terms of the broader culture and our relationship with the broader culture, we are not going to fit in. And we should not expect that the dominant culture around us is going to hold to convictions and beliefs that match Christian convictions. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that because I understand the dynamic of living in a fallen world and a sinful world. And I accept the fact that sort of that's where we are as a cultural moment. And I think it's unrealistic, and I think it's not necessary to expect that the state is going to necessarily even insist upon Christian values when it comes to the adoptive process. So in other words, it may be that in our state that same-sex couples wish to adopt, and the state may permit that, and I can live with that. Now I've got concerns in that, but I can live with it. I can sort of accept that that's just a reality in which we live. But what I find more troubling is that the government is infringing upon and limiting Christians from practicing their beliefs and holding to their convictions. As I said, there are a lot. I think Christian parents are more than twice as likely to adopt as non-Christian families. I think I'm going a little bit by memory here, but I believe the number is something like of all the total adults who have ever considered adopting in the general population, it's about 2% who have actually adopted children, and then there's numbers of who've considered it and been trained for it but haven't followed through and so on. So, but 2% of all the adults have actually followed through with the adoptive process. The number is for Christians is about 5%. So that's twice as many. Now keep in mind, that's those who've actually followed through with the adoptive process. So the Christian community actually plays a huge part in the adoptive world and in exercising their religion, which according to the book of James chapter 1 says that true religion is to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress. In other words, Christians are called to practice care and concern for these vulnerable people, and the state is stepping in and making that more difficult. And maybe the most surprising irony of all of this, let me go back to the requirements of the state when it comes to adoption. The state requires that adoptive families, foster and adoptive families, accept and support the race, ethnicity, cultural identities, national origin, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, disabilities, and here's the last one, second to last one, spiritual beliefs. Now that is so rich in irony because the state is saying we need to be supporting families with diverse spiritual beliefs and practices. And yet they won't do the very same thing for this family who is trying to adopt. Right? They pay lip service to supporting spiritual diversity, but in practice they do not support diversity when it comes to spiritual beliefs and spiritual practices. The state is willing to tolerate and accept spiritual beliefs and practices as long as they don't contradict the ideology of the state. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share this video, pass it around, and we'll see you next time on Speaking Of.